Hello and welcome to Past Virtual Summit 2020. My name's Tom Norman and you're in the Art of Data Classification. A little bit about myself. I'm a database architect with KPA. My LinkedIn account is ArmorDBA and my Twitter account is @ArmorDBA. I was named the 2018 KPA Technology Employee of the Year. And also I am the PASS Virtualization Group Leader. Now, PASS has a lot of things it offers you, not only the summit that you're in, and we want to thank you for coming by today and being with us, but also they've got the PASS Pro membership where you can unlock exclusive trainings, networking, and meet different people and hopefully gain some further experience. Also, there's local groups. I happen to be a member of the Raleigh group. Check it out. I know Denver's got one. I used to be, when I lived in Denver, I was with them. Houston's got one. They're just all over the world. So just check them out at pass.org. Also, SQL Saturdays. They're free one-day local training events. They were in person until COVID-19. There are virtual ones going on now, and hopefully we will get back to the in-person ones here in the near future. There's PASS Marathon, which is also a virtual item that you can go see, and it's a 24 hours normally of sessions throughout one day or 2 days at the most. Then you got the PASS virtual groups, and there's many of them. Check them out on pass.org, join them. You'll get notifications of when we actually have presentations going live, but you can also watch the archives, go to the archives, and you can catch all the sessions there. So catch all the free training that's up there for you. Now, our agenda today. First of all, why do we need to classify data? What's the purpose of it? And then, of course, what data do we need to classify? And then before we can actually classify data, we need to understand the terminology. What does it mean when we look at the different terminology and how we classify data? So that's kind of important that maybe, and we can come up with our own terminology if we want to. And then after we get the terminology and understand the terminology, the next thing to do is start identifying the data to classify. And we'll look at some tools and what we need to do. Basically, there are some free tools and also some paid tools of how to classify data. We'll mention the paid tools. And then protecting and classifying the data, the classified data, how do we protect it? One of the things that we can do with, especially with 2019, is we can go in there, and once we classify it, we can actually set up audits and watch it and see who's touching it and doing things. And once we find out who's touching it, then the next thing we'll want to do is we want to go look at who's touching it and getting reports back to your security audit team and basically reviewing, someone touched this data, why did they touch it? And is it and was there a business need? And if there wasn't, then take the corrective action to fix the problem that might have occurred. So let's first look at why do we want to classify data. So a couple different things here. First of all, we've got a data security strategy, and hopefully you do have a data security strategy. You want to make sure you are, as a DBA, basically the custodian of the company's jewels, the data. And a lot of people want that data. And we want to be able to, when we do this as a custodian, you and I, when we classify the data, number one, we understand it better. And then when we understand it better, then what we can do is we can reduce the risk of a data breach. And I know that none of us want to be on a list of a data breach. And then once we do that, we're going to satisfy the security requirements that our company has. And not only our company has, but our auditors have that audit us. And not only that, but we also have to then adhere to privacy regulations, whether it's Gdpr in the UK or others, which we'll look at in just a moment. And then once we do that, we can also understand the proper storage, the storage technique for accessing the data, that particular data. Maybe what we want to do is we want to put all the secure data on a different LUN or folder and secure it far more heavier and have more least rights to it than we actually do possibly other data. And then also understanding where your data is, you can then remove any redundant or obsolete data. You know, at least in the places I've been in, and I've basically been a very long-term career employee in most companies I've gone to. The current company, for example, we're working on a strategy basically to remove that data, to archive, and talk about archive strategy. And then, of course, once you have less data, then you have less data you have to worry about management cost, hardware cost, etc. So let's talk about what are some of those government regulations that require us, or basically, make sure that we know that we're turning around and classifying the data. Well, some of the data is that we're looking at is the PII, or personal identifiable information. And for those that don't know what that is, that basically is any information that can identify you, whether it's one field of data, like a tax ID number, social security number in the States, or whether it's multiple fields, like it's your first name, last name, middle name, your address, your city, your state, those type of things. So it's going to be, sometimes it's one field, sometimes it's multiple fields. And depending on how it is, it's going to be different ways you can protect that data. The very next thing, of course, you have is the Gdpr regulations. Those are out of Europe. Those are the European, but they affect people all over the world. And then you have the PCI compliance things. You have payment card, credit card data. Hopefully you don't have any of that. You don't have to store it and you have to deal with it. But if you are in one of those databases, then you've got rules that you need to take care of there. Then you have HIPAA, healthcare information, especially this is really relevant within the United States. And then you have the California Consumer Privacy Act. So there may be, of course, and will be far more regulations, government regulations. Please check with your local government with what classifications and what is required for you to do as a keeper of the data for your companies. Now, what data needs classified? Well, there's more than just database, guys. There's far more. And of course, we're going to really focus in on the database portion of it. But as you can see, there's SharePoint, file systems, individual computers, documents that have data in there, and then you also have databases. You've got SQL Server, Oracle, MySQL, whatever databases, other databases there are. You also might have Active Directory that's got some databases. And then once you have the databases, don't forget that not only do you have the data within the database, the current databases, but you have the backups. And some of the rules are that when someone wants to be deleted or forgotten, you basically have to go, you've got to figure out how to even handle your backups. What are you going to do there? And then other systems to look at is, your email systems, and then business to business. What data are you passing between companies? Are you partnering with a third-party company within your application to do something, and you're passing data back and forth? Well, what are you passing, and how's it secure, and how's it taken care of? So there's some things that you might want to know as a company also. So let's, first of all, as we stated, let's look at some data classification terminology, because until we understand that, then we're not going to really understand how to actually properly classify data. So Here's some terminology from SQL Server Management Studio, SSMS, and I'll show you actually where this information came from in a few moments within the demo, but I just wanted to provide this to you at this time so you can better understand it as we get back to classifying the data. And so, first of all, you have public data, business data specifically prepared and approved for public consumption. So one thing that has, for example, to be publicly consumed is your address. Remember I stated that there's PII data. Well, when you're looking at PII data, if I just give you my address and you have just my address, you don't have the city, you don't have the state, you don't have the zip, you don't have anything else about my address, then that really is public information because the post office has it, you get junk mail or whatever through there. So public information, it can be or will be a lot of times a subset of data that you have. Then you also have general data that's basically, you try to, it's business data, and you're basically trying, share it with some places, but not always everywhere. So, and then sensitive data is basically, or confidential data is going to be sensitive data that, if it was shared with unauthorized people, then it could possibly do some harm to your business. Maybe it might be how you make something, or say your financials, some financial plan that you basically are not ready to let know. For example, a lot of times, as we all know, that when Apple or Android or whoever gets ready to release a product or work on a product in R&D, they don't want to leak exactly what they're doing to anyone, because then the competition could basically catch up with them. So that would be some data that might be confidential in the fact until it's officially released to the public. Then you also have confidential GDPR, is how Microsoft labels it in their SSMS. That could be CCPR or PI or whatever you want to talk about it. But when you talk about confidential GDPR, that's really getting down to the person. That's getting down to this data, if it's mishandled, could hurt you as an individual. So, for example, if you're in a data breach and your Social Security number or your tax ID number is leaked, then if you are not doing things to protect yourself, then it's very possible that your data, when it's out there, is going to be, they could pull credit reports or go get new credit. I wouldn't care if they pulled the credit report. I would care if they go buy a $100,000 vehicle and I have to pay for it then, or I have to go basically say I really didn't do it. So it really becomes a very big deal if your data gets leaked. So that would be confidential GDPR. Now, some sensitivity labels, as you notice, this is sensitivity. Then you also have highly confidential. Highly confidential, again, would be data that even within the business itself, you're going to have data that you do not even want to release to your internal employees. Maybe it's just at the executive level, and they're having discussions about whatever, and they're not ready to yet release the information to the entire business, because it would basically, again, really hurt the business if it was leaked out. And then you got the highly confidential GDPR, and of course the most highly confidential GDPR would be your tax identification number that you might have. for how the government identifies you and stuff, and pays taxes, especially if they can go get new credit against you. All right, now some additional information. Once we get through that, then we go look at how we want to restrict that data. You know, what are we going to do in order to protect that data? So when we look at highly confidential data or whatever, then, you know, what are you going to do to restrict it? You're going to do least rights, you're going to do auditing, you're going to do encryption, and you just go on with all the different things that you might do with restricted data. Confidential data, you might just audit it. You might, you know, the thing to remember when you get into encryption is encryption's expensive, okay? Encryption, and I do a session last year on encryption. You can go back and watch it, but just be aware that encryption is expensive and you don't want to encrypt every single field. But in a restricted data categorization, I would probably go ahead and encrypt it, okay? But confidential data, I might just audit it and put other safeguards around the data versus what I would do with restricted. So those are just some things to consider, think about. And then public data, I don't care. Yeah, I really don't care. You know, if you basically see, for example, a zip code, and it's just a table full of zip codes from city and state, because that's, you know, you've got it for whatever purposes that you're using it for. I don't really care if you saw that data, because you can go get the data as easy as I can, you know, off of, you know, the government websites or whatever, and pull down a whole list of city and state with their zip codes or postal codes in different countries and stuff. So whatever data that's publicly accessible, not illegally obtained through a data breach, but that's publicly accessible. For example, you can pull up and go find the address to your favorite pizza parlor or your favorite restaurant. That's publicly accessible data, and they want you to have that data, so you come and visit them and spend your money there. So that particular data, there's nothing to protect because everybody can get to it. So what's some impact levels? So we also want to look at this, of course, when we're looking at all of our data. And the impact level very well may be that if the data is disclosed, you know, there could be, you know, severe catastrophic adverse effects to not only to an individual, but to an organization, the operations of a company, the assets, whatever the case may be. So if, for example, hopefully you would never do this, but if a bank had a vault full of money, for example, they would not want to write down anywhere necessarily what the combination is, or what time the safe, you know, unlocks automatically, or by timer, or whatever the case may be. So you want to really look at data, and if that data is released, is it under a high level? And if it is, then again, that's data that I'm definitely going to encrypt, because I don't want that data to get released. If you accidentally, you know, not accidentally, but on purpose went and got my data, you had data breach. If it's in a high categorization and it happens to be encrypted, great. You know, I've done my job. You can't get to the data. Even if you get the database, you get it open, you look at it, and you go, I guess I'll throw that one away. That was a waste of my time to try to get it. That's what we want to do for the hackers. Okay. Now, moderate would be that it would have severe adverse effects. And depending upon what it is, again, I will look at protecting it in a different fashion than I'm going to protect basically high data. moderate data, yeah, I may audit it, kind of watch and see where it is and see what's accessing it. But I may or may not encrypt it because, again, encryption is expensive. Okay. And then low or limited aspects, if it's a low impact, then again, looking at even less things that I would do to actually protect that data. Now, identifying data to classify. Well, first of all, there's several tools, okay? And part of those tools are the one we're going to look at today and demo today is going to be SQL Server Management Studio. It's getting better, still got things that could do better. But then there's also Adhere's got a SQL column search that will help you out. Adhere also has some paid tools. Adhere SQL Compliance Manager. Redgate's got their SQL Data Catalog, and hopefully the guys haven't renamed their paid products. And then one that a lot of us DBAs have never heard of, but when I was searching and researching the information, the company called Nutric Data Classification also has a tool. And what's interesting about their tool is Redgate and Adhere really is addressing the database. Nutric is addressing basically everything, documents and everything. So they address far, far more than what Adhere or Redgate or SQL Server Microsoft's going to address. We're looking at very niche. They're looking at overall. So last year when I did the encryption session, I did a very similar type of thing, and basically I said, what do we encrypt? Well, today we're not going to be talking about what we're going to encrypt, but what is the classification for these fields? How would you go in and identify, for example, a customer account number, a tax ID number, an email address, first name, birthday? Well, when I go through and classify, this is how I classified them. So I'm going to give you a moment to kind of think here and think about what you would do. Now, customer account ID, is that a public piece of data? And the answer would be probably not. Probably that it's a confidential piece of data. And the reason I would look at a customer account ID as a possible or as a confidential piece of data, if that got out, and you're especially, say, an online type of retailer, could I, as a hacker, get in and buy things underneath that customer's account if I had it? So I might want to look and see exactly how I protect that data and see what I do to make sure that no one else gets that data, especially if my website will allow me to, say, log in with that ID. And if I log in with that ID and guess their password, I can ship a lot of stuff to wherever and turn around and pick it up, and have a lot of stuff. And then we also know, like we talked about, the tax ID number, the Social Security number. That's very confidential, at least it is. The ones I know about, the British number, for example, when I lived as an expat. And also I know the tax ID number is very, very confidential. You can do a lot of things with it here in the States. An email address, I would definitely say, would be confidential data. You would definitely, you're like going, but Tom, that's public. Everybody knows my email address. But how many websites are you logging into that basically that's how you log into the website? Now all of a sudden you have that part of the information about you. All they got to do is guess your password, and basically they're into how many of your websites if that's your login form. Scary, huh, to think about. And then first name would definitely be, by itself, it would not be confidential information because how many Thomases are out there in the world? A lot. So it's not going to necessarily be confidential by itself, but in combination with, say, my last name and other things, then yeah, it could very well be confidential information that we may or may not want to encrypt. And I will tell you from an encryption standpoint, that is, it's a combination of fields for the PII that I would audit, but I'm not going to encrypt that data again due to cost. Next thing, birth date. Birth dates is, it's a date, right? So without the additional information about you, it's really nothing but a date. But if you add additional information, it definitely could talk about you and talk about exactly your information and what that all means and stuff. So anyway, I've got a 92-year-old mother-in-law lives with me, and there's not many 92-year-olds living, so her birthday could identify her pretty easy. If you've got the zip code of where she lives, then you could pretty much find out where she lives because there's probably not a lot of 92-year-olds around. So, additional data. What about these fields? You got the middle name, last four SSN, city, state, postal code. So let's look at those. And this is how I would actually classify the data. Again, the middle name would be confidential GDPR. It does take more than one just a field of middle name. If you had my middle name, you could find a lot of people with that same first name. So it's not necessarily confidential within itself, but it is confidential in a combination of fields. The last four SSN, some people would say that it's confidential. It's just four numbers. So I would classify that as public because without the other five numbers in the United States, it does you no good whatsoever to have those last four numbers. City, state, and postal code or zip code, it all depends upon what you have there and what you're tying with additional data. Independent of themselves, they're just public data. You tie it with my name, and then you're getting into more PI data. So again, it depends on what data is stored there in that table along with it of how you might classify the data. So notice if you just had a table with just city, state, and postal code, and that's all that was in there, then it's just public information. But if you have stored within there also, you have my first name, my last name, my middle initial, say my phone number, my email, along with city, state, and zip, and my address, then basically you are getting into that it could turns into confidential data at that particular point because it could talk about me. And remember the terminology that we talked about a while ago and what makes it confidential. So here's some data that I would highly implore, at least in the United States, but also in other areas, that are restricted and very high impact data that could really cause some damage if you let them get out. And I would even advocate, for example, passwords might be hash data that you can't turn around and unhash the data to go find a password for a moment for that data for the authentication information. You got secret keys, you got encrypted keys, very high impact. Health information, at least in the United States, you got the HIPAA regulations, you got medical treatment notes, you got diagnosis notes, those type of things that would be very restricted and very high impact that you would need to classify. Some additional data that you would probably want to look at. If you happen to store the credit card number, I sure hope you don't store the CCV number also within the database and the expiration date of that credit card in your database. I used to work for a credit card company, and we did not have all three of those values stored in our database. If we did, I'm sure the auditors would have yelled the high heaven, even back then before we even started classifying data. And then, of course, we get into personal identifiable information. You get into the tax ID, driver's license number, health insurance number. You get into those type of things. And again, you get into very restricted, very high impact data that you would look at needing to encrypt. And in both these categories, basically the data that we're looking at right now would be encrypted in some fashion. So that it would not be readily accessible to whoever is using it. Now, we've talked about the terminology. We've talked about now what data we should actually protect and classify. Now let's talk about how do we go in and protect this classified data. And we've mentioned it in several of our discussions already, but here's what you would look at. So one of the things that we do is basically we have transparent data encryption on our databases. Now you're like going, but Tom, that only protects the backup. It only protects the file itself. And you're right, it really does. It only protects the file. But at least that if I gave you, and I would give you today, I'd give you my backup of my production database. But you can't do anything with it because you don't have the certificates and everything else that's required to basically restore that database anywhere else. So without having the additional keys to unlock that backed up database, then the database becomes totally worthless to you. And then if you did have the keys, let's just say that as a hacker, somehow, we as DBAs, did the inevitable and store our encryption certificates with our database backups. Bad idea, very bad idea. They should be stored separately. But if they were, then do you have the fields that we mentioned encrypted? One of the methodologies today that you can do is basically the always encrypted. Again, I have a presentation from last year that you can definitely go to and learn more about how to go encrypt your data. That presentation should now possibly be free, or it will be here shortly. After they're a year old, I think you can just go watch them. So always encrypted and see what's there. Then data classification. Again, we use SQL Server Management Studio. We go in there and classify the data. We make sure that every bit of the data is classified so that we kind of know what to go with. And brings up a good point. Do you classify just the individual fields, or you classify all of them? I've heard both leanings. I could see the purpose of classifying everything, and I can see the purpose of classifying only the fields that need classification. So we only do the ones that need it, and mainly probably do more to a workload. But if you got a bunch of public fields, do I really care? Except it maybe helps identify to you when new fields come along that you need to classify that haven't been classified yet. If you saw the ones that basically have already had, say, public data on them. And then the other thing we do is we have a SQL Audit. We use SQL Audit to look at usage. That's very important. We get a report every day that basically turns around and tells us what data has been accessed and by whom. And what they did, and we'll be looking at a demo of that and exactly how we do that and accomplish that. So once you have classified data, then you can report on the data classification, and your auditors will probably want it. But when you're doing that, when you're reporting on the data, as we were just briefly mentioning just a moment ago, We do have exempt data. Some people would probably say you shouldn't have exempt data. If I didn't have exempt data, my database would be 100 times larger than my production database, just because all the data that the service account access. And you're like going, and that's the only data that we exclude is the service accounts. But one of the things when you're setting up a service account, make sure that your Windows admin, not only are you using a Windows Auth account, but make sure they set it up as a non-loggable account, meaning that basically you can't take that service account and just log in through the UI if you found the password of that service account. That it's there's ways to set things up as an account to log in as a service, for example, also. So make it non-loggable, log in as a service, so that you cannot use that account and log in through the website. So that allows us to exempt that data and not have to worry about it. Then one of the things we do is to accumulate the data that is being retrieved and looked at that's classified. We do have an audit table that we actually bring the data down every day. It processes it, and once it processes it, it actually sends out an email to us. It's also stored in the table, but it sends out an email to the security team and basically says, here's all the data that was accessed yesterday, and here's what we need to review and see what was accessed, and maybe go talk to them and find out why they accessed it. So let's get into some data classification, see how to actually do it, and let's go to the demos now. So let me get this minimized here. So as we're looking at data and stuff, so it is going to be very, very important that we get into, and I think I've got possibly two windows open here, so let me get the other one open here. Okay, first of all, to classify data, you actually go to the database, and I'm going to go ahead and close these windows down so we don't have them opening. And you would right-click on the database. You would go to Task. You would go to Data Classification and Discovery. And then you would go to Classify Data. Now notice that I'm doing this on the database that I'm classifying. There's not a way that I know of today to do it at a full server level, and I'm not sure you would want to do that because depending upon the database you have, you could have literally hundreds of columns you need to look at. So when you first start looking at classifying data, this is Microsoft's tool in SSMS. You have to be on 18.3 or newer, I believe it is, to start doing that. I would totally recommend that you always be on the latest SSMS, since you basically are, it's no longer tied to a SQL Server release. Just go to SSMS download and get the latest version. So let's go ahead and click on and see what it has. So you'll notice that it automatically brings up some classification recommendations. I did nothing to basically turn around and have this come up except choose the report and say, what do you suggest that I classify? Now, remember we were talking about information types, and then we were talking about sensitivity levels, and you'll notice that it automatically goes through and classifies a bunch of data for us. Now, it's interesting as we do that, it's like, how did it get this information and know how to classify? And we'll look at that in just a moment of how Microsoft does it, and basically how you could customize that for yourself if you wanted to include more types of information that you might see. So we're going to go ahead and check a few of these and say we're going to go ahead and take what they're recommending here. So we're going to go and allow it to employee phone type. Well, that's just a type of phone. That's not That's not really confidential data. We're going to put that down to public. Phone number could very well be the type of phone would be like work, home, etc. And then here is also another employee phone type record that might be public. So we're going to go ahead and just accept the recommendations that Microsoft has given us. And then the one thing we need to do is we can always delete them. We can change their classification level based upon what we saw in the terminology that we looked at, Microsoft's terminology. You can also change the information type, what type of information it is if they got it wrong. And then once you do this and you got classified what you want, then the main thing you need to be sure and do is you need to go ahead and save it. If you don't save it, it's not going to keep the data for you. Okay, so very, very important that you go in and you save the data. Now let's go view basically what we're looking at here. So, or let's, before we do that, let's go ahead and kind of look at a table and see how Microsoft actually saves the data. So if we go to employee information here, underneath here, you're not going to find it anywhere in any of these columns and stuff you have. Let's see if we can actually script the table and actually see where it has actually put in the data classification for us. So let's go ahead and script the table out. And as we got it, you can see that we have an encrypted column, of the Social Security number. And you'll notice that the classification has been added to the table under these items here. Okay. Now, note, I am in 2019. 2019 does this a little bit differently with the terminology that they use and the commands they use than what 2016 and 2017 use. But basically, it is an extended classification or extended property on the tables that they do. So it's very, very important that if you have something like SQL Server Data Tools or something like that, to go ahead and add these fields into your table declaration scripts that you store in source control. Please tell me you do. If you ever lost all this information, you would be glad it's in source control. And then turn around and actually save this data and like I said, within the table scripts and put it into source control so that you have it. So that is how SQL Server Management Studio goes in and actually adds the data for you. Now, the nice thing about it is once you do get all this data saved, then you can actually view a report, a nice little report that shows you what you've classified, how many columns have been classified, and the different unique types of data and stuff. And you can actually hit the plus sign and you can actually see all this data and everything. And this report is wonderful. I wish that Microsoft, in fact, I have not put it up as a Connect bug as far as I'm concerned, but whenever you print this report out, it's totally garbage. And what I'll show you is basically you can see what happened when I printed it out. It basically turned around and chopped everything off. It's like, why, Microsoft, why are you not fitting this thing onto a piece of paper that, either, that we can turn around and print the report off, or why not even allow us to export this data and the graphs or whatever into a reporting services report, or something to where that you can report off of. But just FYI for you, the beautiful report that you see within SSMS doesn't translate anywhere. This is a major drawback. Microsoft, if you're listening to me, please fix this because I would like to use this somewhere else. But you know what? I don't know whether you noticed when we were looking at the fields, and now, of course, it's only got the fields that have not been recognized. But you'll notice that possibly it does not always get all the data that you want and stuff. So what you have to do sometimes is add your own data. Maybe it didn't pick up. And notice one of the things it didn't pick up was middle name. So you can add the classification by clicking the Add Classification button. Once you click the Add Classification, you can come over to the table. You can go over to the information, come down here and go find middle name. You'll notice it tells you all the other fields are classified. You can turn around and tell it that basically it is name, and then that it's going to automatically assign confidential GDPR to that particular item. You can add it. It'll add it in for you. Don't forget to save, because if you don't save, you notice that there was a mark there, then basically it is really not actually classified yet. You would have to go back and do it all over again, and you would not be very happy about that scenario. So once you have all this and you've got this information, then what you can do is you can go in. Let me see if I actually probably closed all my windows. So let's go File, and let's go to Recent Files. And let's go into our presentations here, and let's go into our data classification, go to our demo folder. Anyway, there's also a way with T-SQL that you can actually pull up and you can look at that information in addition. And I believe I have it over here. Here it is here in this particular window. Thank you. Sorry about that. I was thinking I had it in the same window. So if I go execute this, this is a way that I can go in and actually look at the sensitivity of it. And I can actually create a report now that I can actually see. I can actually go and put this into print this, and it would print it, or I can download it into Excel or something like that. So sometimes you actually, also need to go do that. And so anyway, so write your own report and you would do well. Now, how did I go about getting all that information that I just shared with you? Well, in Microsoft, and let's go back to SSMS for just a moment here. Let's get it to minimize here and go back into SSMS, and we'll go back into this one here. So when I right click on the database and I go to task and I go to data classification, there's this export information protection policy, and you can set your own, or you can customize the one that Microsoft has, and then you can reset it back to default. Now, what is this export policy protection? And first of all, that is a JSON file, and we were just looking at it, so I will actually pull that back up, get that out of the way for us. We're in Azure Data Studio here, and basically what we've done here is we have pulled that particular report, and you can see where it says public, general, confidential, and you can notice the things that it's bringing in for networking, for contact information, credentials, credit card information type of fields. It's the different patterns and stuff like that that Microsoft is looking for. So just FYI, that's how you can actually go and do that and look at that information. So let's move on. The next thing we want to actually talk about now is we want to go talk about how do we audit this information? How do we go look at what we're doing and where we go from that standpoint. Okay. So like I was telling you, we set up a audit, and the audit that we look at is basically going to be here in security. You look at audits, there's the audit that's being classified. It's telling you basically how big the audit's going to be. You've got to define it, whether it continues on failure, you know, and whether you're going to, what service account and et cetera that it uses. But this is the audit that it creates, okay? And then once you create the audit, the very next thing that you're going to create after the audit is going to be, in this particular case, the database audit. And you'll notice it's by public. So we're going to look at anything that's being selected against the email table or against the employee table. And realize that these audits are basically at the field or at the table level, not at the database level. So you can also see that if you come down and look at database audit specifications. Now, what does this do for us? So once we look at this, what we can actually do, first of all, we're going to need to go get some information. And once we go get that information, we're going to set up, and we're going to basically turn around and set up that the audit folder to where it is. And when we set up that audit folder, what that allows us to do is that allows us to, when we come up here, and I'm going to select against some of the tables that we've seen, and we're just going to select against these here. And I'm going to select again. And now if I go look at the audit file that's turned on that we saw how it's defined, you can see where I'm pulling data of everything that I'm selecting. You can turn around and see all the data that's going on. And where it is, you can see it out of the audit file. What we do then, I'm going to go ahead and truncate the table so I can bring it back in. We then turn around and do a audit, run the stored procedure through a PowerShell script daily. And then when we do that, we then have this data that is now ready to actually report on. So the way we do this is we have a stored procedure that basically goes and captures all this data. Okay, and I put in a +1 for the data. It captures it, it puts it into that table from that audit file that's automatically generated. Okay, and by the way, if you turn the audit on and off, it will notice you. So it even picks you up as a DBA, which the auditors love. And then once you have this data, then what you end up doing is in PowerShell, you can turn around and execute that stored procedure. You can go see if there's any data that needs to be reported on. And if there is data to be reported on, based upon that environment variable telling us what environment we're in, it tells us prod, you know, UAT, whatever we need to know. And then it tells us who we're reporting against. Okay, and then it also turns around and tells us the information that we saw in the query. So I get a nice email every single day that turns around and shows me this information that basically tells me who the person was and what time they selected it and what database and what schema that they were against. And it goes down and it tells me exactly where what they're actually selecting against. So this is important from the standpoint of knowing basically on a daily basis what you are allowed to have. And I will get these scripts cleaned up and uploaded so that you will have these and you can actually go and create your own little audit against your company. And of course, you're going to have to switch out the tables and the names that you want based upon what was in here. That's setting up the audit, and then you would have to change whatever tables and names that you want to actually audit based upon PI and HIPAA data. So very nice to have that every day. Email to our security team. Here's who touched it. And that even includes me as the DBA. Basically, anything I touch, they get a report on also that says Tom Norman touched this data and here's what he selected. So it gives you a very clear picture of any HIPAA breaches or anything like that that might be occurring in your environment. So to wrap this up, this is basically the information you have there to take that with you. Let's go ahead and go back here for a moment. Here's several resources that you have, and you can turn around and actually gather that information that you would like to have. And this is how I got the information, how I gathered the information on the public PDF. This is a government PDF that tells you basically what they believe should be secured. It's very large in size. Neutrix had some great documentation on how to data classify and why you should. So don't forget session evaluations. They're due before Friday, November 20th. If you get them done at 5 p.m. Eastern, you are possibly could win a prize. Don't forget to do those. Thank you. Again, if you have any questions, you can email me below, or if you need anything, let me know, and I'll be glad to assist you. Have a great day and enjoy the rest of PASS Virtual Summit 2020. Thank you.